We all know the story of the king who abdicated for love, but this is the story of Prince Nicholas of Romania, the man who was destroyed for it. He didn't voluntarily walk away. He was erased, stripped of his titles, his fortune, and his name by his own brother. This is the tragic, true story of a man who lost a kingdom to save his soul. But to make sense of how a prince loses everything, we cannot simply start with the man himself. We must first understand the stage upon which he was born, a stage that was as magnificent as it was unstable. The kingdom of Romania in the early 20th century was a paradox. It was a Latin island in a Slavic sea, a nation that looked desperately toward the sophisticated salons of Paris for its culture, while its roots were deeply embedded in the rugged, mystical soil of the Balkans. It was a young kingdom, having only recently shaken off the heavy yoke of the Ottoman Empire, and to secure its place among the great powers of Europe, it had imported a royal family. The Hohenzollern Sigmaringens were German, Catholic, and rigid, brought in to bring Prussian discipline to a chaotic land. But by the time Nicholas was born, that German steel was being tempered and perhaps softened by a new influence. That influence was his mother, Queen Marie. To speak of Nicholas without speaking of Marie is impossible, for she was the sun around which the entire Romanian court orbited. A granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England and Tsar Alexander II of Russia, Marie was arguably the most dazzling royal woman of her era. She was not a distant figurehead. She was a force of nature, romantic, dramatic, politically astute, and fiercely protective of her adopted country. When Nicholas was born on August 5, 1903, at the fairy tale Pelish Castle in the Carpathian Mountains, he was born into this strange high-pressure crucible. Pelish itself was a symbol of this dichotomy, a neo-Renaissance masterpiece filled with German armor and Italian paintings, nestled in the wild, vampire-haunted forests of Transylvania. Nicholas was the second son, the fourth child of Crown Prince Ferdinand and Marie. In the strict hierarchy of royal succession, the spare is often a difficult position. The heir is groomed for power, burdened with expectations, and often crushed by them. The spare, however, is often allowed a degree of freedom, a benign neglect that allows their true personality to flourish. This was certainly true for Nicholas. While his older brother Carol grew up moody, neurotic, and prone to wild emotional swings, traits that would later spell disaster for the nation, Nicholas grew into a sunny, robust, and uncomplicated child. He had his mother's blue eyes and her mischievous wit. In the royal nursery, while Carol was often brooding or engaging in manipulative behavior, Nicholas was the peacemaker, the jester, the one who could make the stern King Carol I crack a smile. But the golden haze of this Edwardian childhood was shattered in 1914. The outbreak of the Great War tore Europe apart and placed the Romanian royal family in an agonizing position. King Carol I, the patriarch, was German by blood and loyalty, yet Romania's national interest lay with the Allies. When the old king died broken-hearted in 1914, Nicholas's father Ferdinand ascended the throne. Ferdinand was a shy, hesitant man, often overshadowed by his wife, but he made the heroic decision to fight against his own German homeland for the sake of Romania. For young Nicholas, now entering his teenage years, the war was a formative trauma. He saw his country overrun by the Central Powers. He saw the royal court forced to flee Bucharest, retreating to the city of Iași in Moldavia, enduring a brutal winter where typhus and hunger stalked even the palaces. It was during these dark years in Iași that the character of the young prince began to solidify. While the world around them collapsed, Nicholas did not retreat into entitlement. Observers from the time noted a certain grounding in him. He was fascinated by mechanics, by how things worked. He spent time with the drivers and the mechanics of the Royal Motor Pool, getting his hands greasy, learning the internal combustion engine inside and out. This passion for machinery was more than a hobby. It was a manifestation of his personality. He liked things that were tangible, real, and solvable. Politics was messy and duplicitous. An engine was honest. If it was broken, you fixed it. This directness, this lack of pretense, endeared him to the soldiers and the common people in a way that Carroll's erratic brilliance never could. When the war ended, Romania emerged not just victorious, but transformed. Through the sheer force of Queen Marie's diplomacy at the Paris Peace Conference, the kingdom doubled in size, becoming Greater Romania. The court returned to Bucharest in triumph. The 1920s roared into life, and Nicholas, now a handsome young man in his early 20s, became a symbol of this new, vibrant era. He was the dashing Prince Charming of the Balkans. He was an officer in the Romanian Navy, looking spectacular in uniform, but he was most at home behind the wheel of a high-performance sports car. He was a speed demon, famously driving the treacherous mountain roads between Bucharest and Sinaia at breakneck speeds, terrifying his passengers, but always maintaining perfect control. However, beneath the jazz-age surface of parties and car races, a rot was spreading at the heart of the dynasty, and its name was Carroll. The heir to the throne, Nicholas's elder brother, was spiraling out of control. Carroll's life was a chaotic procession of scandals. He had already deserted his regiment during the war to marry a commoner, Zizi Lambrino, a marriage that was annulled but produced a child. He was then married off to Princess Helen of Greece to secure the dynasty, a union that produced a son, Michael, but was devoid of love. By 1925, Carroll had found a new obsession, Magda Lupescu, a woman with a reputation as a femme fatale, whom his enemies utilized as a lightning rod for anti-Semitic rhetoric and moral outrage. Nicholas watched this unfolding disaster with a mixture of brotherly loyalty and growing alarm. He and Carroll had been close in their youth, bound by the unique isolation of their position. But as they matured, their paths diverged. Nicholas was a man of duty who enjoyed his pleasures within the boundaries of discretion. Carroll was a man who believed his pleasures were his duty, or at least that his status exempted him from consequences. The contrast was stark. Nicholas was the reliable good boy, the favorite of the army and the people, while Carroll was the brilliant but unstable liability. The breaking point came in December 1925. In a fit of passion and resentment against his parents' disapproval of his affair with Magda Lupescu, Carroll did the unthinkable. From Venice, he sent a letter renouncing his rights to the throne. He chose his mistress over his country, his wife, and his young son. It was a bombshell that threatened to destabilize the entire region. King Ferdinand, already dying of cancer, was devastated. Queen Marie was heartbroken. The Crown Council was convened in a panic. They had to decide, do they beg the erratic Carroll to return, or do they accept his resignation and move on? Ultimately, the king and the government decided they could no longer tolerate Carroll's blackmail. On January 4th, 1926, the Romanian parliament ratified the Act of Renunciation. Carroll was out. His 4-year-old son, Michael, was proclaimed the heir apparent. But a 4-year-old cannot rule. A regency council had to be established to govern Romania until Michael came of age in the distant future of the 1940s. And this is where the weight of history crashed down upon the shoulders of Prince Nicholas. He was just 22 years old. He wanted to race cars, travel the world, and perhaps find a wife of his own choosing eventually. He had no desire for political power. He had never been groomed for statecraft. Yet he was the only remaining adult male of the royal bloodline in Romania. The constitution and the king demanded his service. He was appointed as the head of the Regency Council, alongside the Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church and the President of the Supreme Court. Imagine the scene: a young man, vibrant and full of life, suddenly realizing that the iron gates of the palace were closing around him. He was no longer just the fun-loving Prince Nicky. He was now the primary stabilizer of a fragile nation surrounded by hostile neighbors. He wrote to a friend during this period, expressing a profound sense of entrapment, likening his new position to a prison sentence. He knew that his brother's abandonment had not just vacated a throne, it had placed a target on Nicholas's back. By accepting the regency, by stepping up to do the duty his brother had refused, Nicholas was unwittingly becoming Carol's rival. He was stepping into the vacuum, and in the game of thrones, nature abhors a vacuum. As 1926 bled into 1927, the tragedy deepened. King Ferdinand, the unifying father figure, passed away in July 1927. The grief was immense, but for Nicholas there was no time to mourn. Almost immediately he had to swear allegiance to his own nephew, the 5-year-old King Michael. The sight was heartbreakingly absurd. The tall, athletic Nicholas kneeling before a confused little boy in short pants, pledging his life and sword to him. In that moment, Nicholas became the de facto ruler of Romania. He was the first regent. The fate of the dynasty rested in his hands. He was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by wolves, politicians who saw the regency as a weak interim government ripe for manipulation. Yet, contrary to the expectations of the cynics, Nicholas rose to the occasion. He did not have the intellectual pretension of Carol, but he had something more valuable: common sense and a lack of ego. He understood that his role was to be a placeholder, a guardian. He relied on advisors. He charmed the diplomatic corps, and he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in a court that was traumatized by Carol's desertion and Ferdinand's death. The British diplomatic cables from this time described Nicholas with surprising warmth, noting his unexpected gravitas and his genuine desire to do right by his nephew. He took his role as a surrogate father to the little King Michael seriously, trying to shield the boy from the harsh glare of politics. But the ghost of Carol loomed large. From his exile in France, Carol watched. He saw Nicholas becoming popular. He saw the army rallying around the young regent. And jealousy began to curdle into hatred. The narrative in Carol's mind shifted. Nicholas was no longer the loyal little brother. He was the usurper. He was the one sitting in the seat that Carol had vacated, enjoying the adulation that Carol believed was his birthright. In the smoke-filled cafes of Bucharest, Carol's agents began to whisper. They spread rumors that Nicholas was incompetent, that the regency was corrupt, that the country needed a strong hand. Nicholas, in his naivety, did not see the knives being sharpened. He was struggling with his own personal loneliness. The regency was a lonely peak. He was surrounded by old men, the patriarch and the judge, and aggressive politicians. He had no partner to share this burden with. The protocols of the court were stifling. Every move he made was scrutinized. It was in this atmosphere of intense pressure and isolation that Nicholas's heart became vulnerable. He was a man who felt things deeply, a man who craved genuine connection in a world of artifice. He was performing his duty impeccably, but his soul was starving. He did not know it yet, but he was drifting toward a collision course with destiny, a moment where the hunger for personal happiness would collide violently with the rigid steel of the state. The stage was set for the entrance of the woman who would change everything, the woman for whom he would eventually sacrifice it all. But before he could meet her, he would first have to make the biggest political mistake of his life, a mistake born of brotherly love that would ultimately seal his doom. The years of the Regency from 1927 to 1930 were not merely a political interregnum. They were a slow-motion car crash for the Romanian monarchy. Prince Nicholas, sitting at the head of the table, found himself trapped in a suffocating web of intrigue that would have baffled even the most seasoned statesman. He was a young man in his mid-20s, a time when he should have been discovering himself, yet he was forced to act as the father to a nation that was rapidly becoming ungovernable. The Great Depression was beginning to cast its long, dark shadow over Europe, and Romania's agricultural economy was teetering on the brink of collapse. In the halls of the royal palace, the atmosphere was toxic. The politicians, particularly the powerful National Peasant Party led by Iuliu Maniu, viewed the regency as weak and ineffective. They looked at Nicholas and saw not a ruler, but a placeholder, a well-meaning amateur trying to navigate a ship through a hurricane. Nicholas felt this inadequacy keenly. He was a man of action, a pilot and a naval officer, used to clear commands and tangible results. In politics, however, nothing was clear. Every decision was a compromise. Every ally was a potential traitor. He later confided that during these years, he felt a crushing sense of loneliness. He was the most eligible bachelor in the Balkans, yet he was utterly isolated. He could trust no one. His mother, Queen Marie, who had been the power behind the throne for so long, was being sidelined by the misogynistic political class who wanted to diminish her influence. Nicholas watched as his mother, the woman who had essentially built Greater Romania, was treated with increasing disrespect. This angered him, fueling his disillusionment with the crown. He began to look for an exit strategy, a way to lay down this burden that he never asked for. And so, the seed of the restoration was planted. It is a cruel irony of history that Nicholas himself was one of the primary architects of his own destruction. In his mind, the return of his brother Carol was the only logical solution. He remembered the Carol of their youth, the brilliant, if moody, elder brother who knew how to command a room. Nicholas convinced himself that Carol's time in exile had matured him. He believed the narrative that Carol had been a victim of a love affair gone wrong, and that if given a second chance, he would return as a wise and chastened king, ready to save Romania from the squabbling politicians. It was a projection of Nicholas's own honest nature onto a brother who possessed none of it. Nicholas began to communicate secretly with Carol in Paris. He became a conspirator against his own regency, driven by love for his brother and a desperate desire to be free of the throne. The plot culminated in June 1930. It was a high-stakes gamble that played out like a thriller. Carol, using a false passport and disguised, flew from Munich to Romania. When his plane landed on June 6th, the country held its breath. The army, which had always adored the martyred Prince Carol, rallied instantly to his side. The coup was swift and bloodless because the man who should have stopped it, Prince Nicholas, opened the gates wide. On June 8, 1930, the Parliament voted to annul the Act of 1926. Carol's renunciation was declared void. In a blink of an eye, the 5-year-old King Michael was deposed, demoted back to the rank of Crown Prince, and his father was proclaimed King Carol II. The scene of the reunion between the brothers was publicly touching, but privately complex. Nicholas was the first to welcome Carol. There are reports that when Carol walked into the palace, Nicholas looked at him with genuine relief, literally and metaphorically handing over the keys to the kingdom. I feel like a man who has just put down a crushing sack of bricks, Nicholas reportedly told a confidant. He truly believed he had saved the dynasty. He imagined a future where he and Carol would work side by side, Carol as the political mastermind, and Nicholas as the loyal military chief, the supportive brother, finally free to live his own life in the shadow of the throne, rather than in its glare. He was tragically mistaken. The Carol who returned was not the chastened penitent Nicholas had imagined. He was vindictive, paranoid, and power-hungry. Years of exile had embittered him. He returned with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Carpathians. Almost immediately, the dynamic shifted. Carol II did not view Nicholas's regency as a service to the family. He viewed it as a usurpation. He was jealous of Nicholas. During the 3 years of Carol's absence, Nicholas had become the darling of the public. He was handsome, unproblematic, and possessed a natural, easygoing charm that Carol, with his nervous tics and arrogant demeanor, lacked. The crowds cheered for Nicholas with a warmth that they never showed Carol. For a narcissist like Carol, too, this was unforgivable. Whatever gratitude Carol might have felt for Nicholas's help in the restoration evaporated within weeks. The new king began to systematically dismantle Nicholas's influence. He removed Nicholas from key positions, sidelined his friends, and kept him under surveillance. But the ultimate betrayal was personal. One of the conditions for Carol's return, brokered by Prime Minister Manu, was that he would leave his mistress, Magda Lupescu, behind. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Yet within months, Magda was back in Romania, installed in a villa near the palace, wielding more power than the government ministers. Carol had lied to everyone, including Nicholas. The corruption and intrigue that Nicholas had hoped to end only intensified. The court became a nest of vipers, with Madame Lupescu at the center, and Nicholas found himself an outsider in his own home. It was against this backdrop of political disillusionment and brotherly betrayal that Nicholas's life took its definitive turn. He was 27 years old, a prince of the blood, inspector general of the army, yet he felt spiritually hollow. He was tired of the shallow socialites that his mother tried to set him up with. He was tired of the dynastic game. And then fate intervened on a dusty Romanian road. The story of how Prince Nicholas met Ioana Dumitrescu Doletti is shrouded in the mists of romantic legend, often retold with variations, but the core of it is pure cinema. It was the autumn of 1930. Nicholas, driving one of his beloved sports cars, was reportedly involved in a minor traffic incident or stopped to assist a stalled vehicle on the road to Snagoff. The driver was a woman. When she stepped out, Nicholas was struck thunderbolt still. Ioana was not a princess. She was not even a debutante from the high aristocracy. She was the daughter of a landowner from Tohani, a woman of the upper middle class, but she possessed a beauty that was arresting. Dark-haired, with intelligent, piercing eyes and a poise that intimidated lesser men, she was technically a married woman at the time, though estranged from her husband, Radu Savianu. She was older than the debutantes Nicholas was used to. She was mature, grounded, and unimpressed by titles. She didn't swoon, she engaged him. For Nicholas, who had spent his life surrounded by sycophants and people who wanted something from him, Ioana was a revelation. She saw him, the man behind the uniform, the mechanic who loved engines, the lonely soul who loved his country but hated its politics. Their courtship began in the shadows. It had to. In the rigid social stratification of 1930s, Romania, a prince of the blood simply did not date a commoner, let alone a married woman. But the heart of a Hohenzollern is a stubborn thing. Nicholas, often dismissed as the easygoing one, discovered a vein of iron will when it came to Ioana. He pursued her with the same intensity he drove his cars. By 1931, Ioana had secured a divorce, making her free. But in the eyes of the royal house, she was damaged goods. A divorcee was anathema. Yet Nicholas was deeply, irrevocably in love. This was not the fleeting lust of his brother Carol. This was a profound connection of souls. Nicholas approached his brother the king to ask for permission to marry. He expected, if not support, at least understanding. After all, Carol was the man who had renounced the throne twice for women. Carol was the man openly living in sin with Magda Lupescu, a divorcee herself, in full view of the public. Surely Carol, of all people, would understand the power of love over duty. The response he received was a cold splash of reality that froze his blood. King Carol II forbade the marriage. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Carol sat behind his desk, the portrait of the monarch, and lectured Nicholas on dynastic duty and the purity of the bloodline. He cited the statute of the royal house, which demanded that members of the royal family marry only into other royal houses. He told Nicholas that he could keep Ioana as a mistress. That was perfectly acceptable, standard royal practice, just as Carol kept Magda. But marriage to legitimize her? Absolutely not. This refusal was not born of principle. It was born of fear. Carol II was terrified of Nicholas. He knew that if Nicholas settled down with a respectable, intelligent Romanian wife, he would become a power couple that could rival the king's own popularity. The public hated Magda Lupescu. They called her the red-haired plague. If Nicholas married Ioana, a beautiful Romanian woman, they would present a wholesome, stable alternative to Carol's scandalous court. Carol needed Nicholas to remain a playboy or to marry a foreign princess who would be disconnected from the people. He could not afford a popular, happily married brother. Nicholas left that meeting with his brother shattered, but also resolved. He realized then that the brother he loved was gone, consumed by the king. He realized that the rules applied only to him, not to the monarch. He was faced with the ultimate choice, the gilded cage of royalty, a life of duty without love, a life of hiding the woman who made him whole, or the unthinkable path of rebellion. Nicholas chose rebellion. He did not shout it from the rooftops. He acted with quiet, determined precision. On November 7, 1931, in the small, sleepy village of Tohani, far from the prying eyes of the Bucharest press, Prince Nicholas of Romania and Ioana Dumitrescu Doleti stood before a mayor and a priest. It was a modest ceremony. There were no royal trumpets, no carriages, no crowds waving flags, just two people stripping away the weight of history to make a vow to one another. Nicholas knew exactly what he was doing. By marrying without the king's consent, he was handing his brother a loaded gun. He was technically violating the royal statute. But looking into Ioana's eyes, he decided that the price, whatever it might be, was worth paying. He hoped, perhaps naively, that once the deed was done, Carol would accept the fait accompli. He hoped that the king would fume for a while, perhaps punish him privately, but eventually accept Ioana as he had forced the country to accept Magda. He did not anticipate the ferocity of the storm that was about to break. He did not realize that he had just given his brother the perfect weapon to destroy him. The honeymoon would be short. The war was about to begin. The morning after the wedding in Tohani, the world did not immediately end, but the air in the royal palace in Bucharest had changed, charged with the static of an approaching storm. Nicholas and Ioana had returned to the capital, attempting to resume their lives as if they had not just lit a fuse under the throne, but in a police state like Romania under Carol II, secrets were a currency that devalued rapidly. The intelligence services, the siguranța, were everywhere, in the cafes, in the telephone exchanges. and certainly in the shadows of the royal residences. It wasn't long before the king received the dossier. One can imagine the scene in Carol's office, the heavy oak desk, the cloud of cigarette smoke, and the king's face purpling with a rage that was less about dynastic law and more about a narcissistic injury. Nicholas had defied him. The little brother, the obedient spare, had dared to assert his autonomy. When the confrontation finally came, it was brutal. Carol II did not act like a brother. He acted like an autocrat. He demanded that Nicholas renounce the marriage immediately. He demanded an annulment. He screamed about the honor of the Hohenzollerns, a concept that sounded particularly hollow coming from a man who had dragged that same name through the tabloids of every capital in Europe. Nicholas stood his ground. For the first time in his life, he did not yield to Carol's bullying. He argued that his marriage was a private matter, that Ioana was a woman of good standing, and that his happiness should not threaten the state. He pointed out the glaring elephantine hypocrisy in the room. Carol was living openly with Magda Lupescu, a woman despised by the church and the army, yet he denied Nicholas the right to a sanctified marriage with a respected Romanian woman. Carol's response was to declare war. He refused to recognize the marriage in the official gazette and the court circulars. Ioana did not exist. To the crown, she was a non-person, a ghost. If Nicholas attended a state dinner, he attended alone. If there was a military parade, Ioana was nowhere to be seen. It was a humiliating psychological siege designed to break Ioana's spirit and force Nicholas to choose between his social existence and his wife. But Carol had miscalculated. He assumed Nicholas was weak. He didn't understand that for Nicholas, the marriage was not a fling. It was his sanctuary. The more the king attacked Ioana, the more protective and stubborn Nicholas became. The couple withdrew from the toxic atmosphere of the court, creating their own private world, a court in exile within Bucharest itself, frequented by artists, writers, and those brave few who dared to risk the king's wrath. For the next 6 years, from 1931 to 1937, a Cold War raged between the two brothers. It was a war fought with bureaucratic weapons and petty cruelties. Carol II began to strip away Nicholas's privileges, one by one. First, there were cuts to his financial allowance, a squeeze designed to make the high life of a prince impossible to maintain. Then came the removal of honorary titles and patronages. Nicholas, who was Inspector General of the Army and deeply beloved by the officer corps, found his orders questioned, his authority undermined by the king's favorites. The army loved Nicholas. He was one of them, a soldier's soldier, and this terrified Carol. The king saw the specter of a military coup in every shadow. He feared that the army, disgusted by his own affair with Lupescu and the rampant corruption of his regime, might rally around the clean, honorable Nicholas and install him as a military dictator or a regent once again. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. In the mid-1930s, Romania was a boiling cauldron of political extremism. The Iron Guard, a far-right ultra-nationalist movement, was gaining power, preaching a gospel of spiritual purification and death to corruption. While Nicholas was not a fascist and held no sympathy for their violence, the Iron Guard's propaganda often contrasted the decadent King Carol with the martyred Prince Nicholas. They used Nicholas's name without his permission as a symbol of what the monarchy could be: dignified, Romanian, and moral. This made Nicholas infinitely more dangerous to Carol. Every time a peasant cheered for Nicholas, Carol heard the sound of a guillotine being sharpened. The situation became untenable in 1937. The political landscape of Europe was darkening. Hitler was in power in Germany. The Spanish Civil War was raging. and Carol II felt the need to consolidate absolute power. He could no longer tolerate a rival center of gravity in his own family. He needed Nicholas gone, fully and permanently. The king decided to fire the final salvo. He presented Nicholas with an ultimatum delivered with the cold detachment of an executioner: divorce Ioana immediately and return to the fold as a dutiful prince, or face the ultimate consequences. Nicholas did not hesitate. He looked at the brother he had once worshipped, the brother he had helped restore to the throne, and he saw a stranger. He realized that a title without honor was just a word, and a kingdom without love was just a prison. He refused the ultimatum. On April 9, 1937, the king convened the Crown Council. It was a kangaroo court, a piece of political theater. The counselors, hand-picked men loyal to Carol or too afraid to speak up, sat around the table to judge a prince of the blood. The charges were vague violations of the royal statute, but the verdict had been written before the meeting began. With a stroke of a pen, history was rewritten. The council issued a decree that stripped Prince Nicholas of his royal rank. He was no longer a prince of Romania. He was no longer a Hohenzollern. He was stripped of his succession rights, removed from the army, and barred from wearing the uniform he had served in for 20 years. But the king's vindictiveness went further. He wanted to humiliate Nicholas, to erase his identity. He decreed that Nicholas would henceforth be a commoner, forced to adopt the name Nicolae Brana. The name was chosen with malice. Brana was the name of a minor locality, a subtle insult to minimize his stature. It was a symbolic castration. The man who had been the regent of Romania, the head of state, was now, legally speaking, nobody. The news shocked the nation. The Romanian public, largely unaware of the depth of the fratricidal hatred, was stunned. But censorship was tight. The newspapers, controlled by the palace, spun the story as a necessary act to preserve the integrity of the dynasty. They painted Nicholas as a wayward, disobedient son who had chosen a woman over his duty to the nation. It was a classic smear campaign. Nicholas was given no platform to defend himself, no chance to tell his side of the story. He was given a passport with the name Nicolae Brana and ordered to leave the country immediately. The departure was a quiet, heartbreaking affair. There were no crowds to wave goodbye at the Gara de Nord. Nicholas and Ioana packed their belongings, the remnants of a royal life, into trunks. As they boarded the train that would take them into exile, Nicholas took one last look at the city of Bucharest. He was leaving behind his childhood home, his friends, his career, and his heritage. He was leaving behind the grave of his father, King Ferdinand, and the memory of his mother, Queen Marie, who was now old, sick, and sidelined in Balchik, heartbroken by the war between her sons. Marie had tried to intervene, writing desperate letters to Carol, begging him not to exile his brother, but the king had ignored her. In his quest for power, Carol had broken the family irrevocably. As the train chugged out of the station, heading west toward the border, Nicholas sat in the compartment holding Ioana's hand. He was 33 years old. Yesterday he was a royal highness, a potential king, a general. Today he was Mr. Brana, a stateless exile with an uncertain future. But as the familiar landscapes of Romania, the sunflower fields, the oil derricks of Ploiești, the peaks of the Carpathians, rolled past the window for the last time, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had lost everything that the world told him was valuable, but he had kept the one thing that was real. He looked at Ioana, the woman who had cost him a kingdom, and he did not regret a single thing. They settled first in Italy, then traveled through Europe, wandering ghosts of a royalty that no longer recognized them. They were part of a growing tribe of displaced royals in the 1930s and 40s. But unlike the others who had lost their thrones to revolutions or wars, Nicholas had lost his to his own brother. In 1938, Queen Marie died. Nicholas was denied permission to return for the funeral. He was forced to grieve from afar, listening to the radio broadcast of the ceremony, knowing that his brother was walking behind the gun carriage while he, the son who had actually loved her without motive, was banned from the country. It was a final petty knife twist from Carol II. But history has a way of delivering justice, even if it is slow. While Nicholas lived a quiet, modest life in exile, driving cars and skiing in Switzerland, the reign of King Carol II was collapsing. The king's house of cards, built on corruption and intrigue, could not withstand the geopolitical earthquake of World War II. In 1940, Greater Romania, the legacy of King Ferdinand and Queen Marie, was dismembered. The Soviet Union seized Bessarabia, Hungary took northern Transylvania, Bulgaria took southern Dobruja. The country was in shock. The army and the people turned on the king. The dictator Marshal Ion Antonescu forced Carol II to abdicate in September 1940. Carol fled the country in a train riddled with bullets from the Iron Guard, taking Magdalupescu and wagon loads of treasures with him. He would never return. The young Michael I ascended the throne for the second time, and one of the young king's first acts in the midst of war and chaos was a quiet attempt to heal the wound his father had inflicted. In 1942, King Michael signed a decree. He could not fully undo the past. The politics were too delicate, but he restored his uncle's name. Nicholas was no longer Brena. He was recognized as Prince Nicholas of Hohenzollern. It was a partial rehabilitation, an acknowledgement that the stripping of his title had been an act of vengeance, not law. But for Nicholas, the restoration of a name did not mean the restoration of a life. Romania was now engulfed in the flames of World War II, fighting alongside Nazi Germany against the Soviets. Nicholas, from his exile in Switzerland, watched in horror as his country bled. He wanted to help, to serve, but he was on the outside looking in. And then the darkness fell completely. In 1947, the communists forced King Michael to abdicate. The monarchy was abolished. The Iron Curtain slammed down. Nicholas was now doubly exiled, banished by his brother, and now banished by history itself. He would never see Romania again. By 1948, the map of Europe had been redrawn in red ink. The monarchy in Romania was not just suspended, it was obliterated. The People's Republic had been proclaimed, and a darkness descended over the Carpathians that would last for 42 years. For Prince Nicholas, living in the pristine, neutral quiet of Switzerland, this was a second, more permanent death. His exile was no longer a family quarrel that might be resolved with the passing of a brother or a change of heart. It was now a geopolitical reality, enforced by Soviet tanks and barbed wire. He was 45 years old, a man in the prime of his life, yet he found himself a prince without a principality, a soldier without an army, and a statesman without a state. The vibrant, dashing youth who had raced cars through Sinai was gone. In his place was a mature man, his face lined with the peculiar, weary dignity of the displaced. Life in exile is a strange purgatory. It is a life of waiting, of listening to radio broadcasts for news of home, of reading newspapers that arrive days late. For Nicholas and Ioana, settled now in Lausanne, the days of royal glamour were over. They were not destitute. Nicholas had managed to salvage some assets, and he had loyal friends, but they were far from wealthy. The lavish lifestyle of the 1920s was replaced by a modest bourgeois existence. They lived in a rented villa, not a palace. Nicholas, once the ruler of millions, now had to worry about bills, about the cost of heating oil, about the mundane practicalities of survival. Yet those who knew them during this period described a couple who were remarkably content. The loss of the kingdom had in a strange way liberated Nicholas. Stripped of the toxic politics of the Bucharest court, away from the prying eyes of the press and the paranoia of his brother, he could finally just be. He and Ioana were inseparable. Their love, forged in scandal and hardened by persecution, had mellowed into a profound, quiet companionship. They were partners in every sense. Ioana, with her sharp intelligence and grounding presence, was his anchor. She managed their household, organized their social life, and provided the emotional stability that Nicholas had never received from his own family. They were often seen walking together by the shores of Lake Geneva, a tall, distinguished man, and a woman who still turned heads with her elegance, two castaways clinging to the raft of their affection. Nicholas found solace in the tangible. He returned to his old loves, mechanics, and sport. He became a familiar figure in the Swiss automotive scene, tinkering with engines, attending races, and driving with the skill of a professional. He took up skiing with a passion, finding in the clean, cold air of the Alps a reminder of the Carpathians he had lost. He also discovered a talent for painting. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, the former regent would stand before an easel, capturing landscapes and still lifes. It was a form of therapy, a way to impose order and beauty on a canvas when the world outside was chaotic and cruel. However, the shadow of Romania was never far away. The Romanian diaspora, the thousands of intellectuals, officers, and politicians who had fled the communist regime, looked to the royal family for leadership. King Michael, now also in exile and living in Switzerland and later England, was the undisputed head of the dynasty. But Nicholas played a crucial, if quieter, role. He became a patron of Romanian culture in exile. He understood that while the communists could occupy the land, they could not occupy the soul of the nation if its culture was preserved abroad. He supported Romanian Orthodox churches in Western Europe, attended cultural gatherings, and used his connections to help refugees who were struggling to start new lives in the West. Interestingly, the relationship between Nicholas and his nephew, King Michael, began to thaw during these years. Michael, a man of immense integrity, had always felt uncomfortable with how his father, Carol II, had treated Nicholas. Now that Carol was dead, the toxic wedge between them was gone. Michael and Nicholas, both victims of Carol's selfishness and both victims of history, found a new understanding. Michael treated Nicholas with the respect due a prince of the blood. At family gatherings, Nicholas was once again Uncle Nicky, the senior male of the family, a respected elder rather than a disgraced outcast. It was a quiet rehabilitation, a healing of old wounds that brought Nicholas a great deal of peace. He was no longer Nicolae Brina, he was Prince Nicholas of Hohenzollern, a title that acknowledged his bloodline even if it did not restore his succession rights. But fate, it seemed, was not done with testing Nicholas. The love story of the century, as he privately viewed it, was approaching its final tragic chapter. In the late 1950s, the health of his beloved Ioana began to fail. The woman who had been his rock, who had endured the scorn of a king and the loss of a country for his sake, fell ill. They moved to Spain, seeking a warmer climate that might help her constitution, settling in Madrid, which had become a hub for exiled European royalty. The move to Madrid marked the beginning of the end. Watching Ioana fade was a torture far worse than any political exile. Nicholas, the man of action, was helpless against the slow, inexorable march of disease. He became her nurse, her constant companion, rarely leaving her bedside. Friends who visited them in Madrid described a heartbreaking scene. The prince, gray-haired and somber, holding the hand of his frail wife, reading to her, trying to keep the darkness at bay with the sheer force of his devotion. On a cold day in 1963, the light went out of Nicholas's life. Ioana Dumitrescu Doleti, the woman for whom he had given up a throne, passed away. She was buried in a modest ceremony in Madrid. Nicholas was devastated. He was 57 years old, and for the first time in 3 decades, he was truly alone. The silence in the villa was deafening. He had sacrificed his royal destiny for this partnership, and now he was left with only the memory of it. The grief was profound. Nicholas withdrew from the world for a time. He wrote in his diaries of a vast emptiness, a sense that his life's purpose had been severed. The critics and the dynastic purists had always said it was a mistake, a folly. But standing by her grave, Nicholas knew they were wrong. The 30 years he had with Ioana were worth more than any crown. He had lived a life of truth. He had not lived a lie like his brother Carol. He had paid the price, yes, but he had bought something priceless, a love that was absolute. In the aftermath of her death, Nicholas sought to honor her memory in the only way he knew how. He established the Princess Ioana Cultural Foundation. It was a defiant gesture. By naming a foundation after her, by attaching the title princess to her name, a title she was denied in life by the rigid laws of the court, he was crowning her in death. He was telling the world and history that she was his princess. Regardless of what the statute said, the foundation worked to support Romanian scholars and artists in exile, a living legacy to the woman who had supported him. The 1960s dragged on, a gray decade for the lonely prince. He continued to live in Madrid, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. He was a relic of a bygone era, a living footnote in the history books. He saw the world changing rapidly, the Beetle, the space race, but his world remained frozen in the amber of 1930s Romania. He wrote memoirs, he organized his papers, he corresponded with the dwindling number of old friends who remembered the world before the war. Yet the human heart is resilient, and Nicholas was a survivor. He was not a man to wallow in self-pity forever. He had a robust constitution and a lingering zest for life. As the years passed, the raw edge of grief began to dull. He started to appear in society again, a distinguished elderly gentleman with impeccable manners and a sad smile. And it was in this twilight of his life that a final, unexpected grace note sounded. He met a woman named Teresa Figueira de Mello, a Brazilian from a noble family. She was different from Ioana. She did not carry the weight of the past, the shared trauma of the Romanian struggle. She offered something Nicholas desperately needed: companionship and a gentle, undemanding affection to see him through his final years. It was not the fiery, earth-shattering passion he had shared with Ioana. It was an autumnal love, a comfort against the coming winter. They married in 1967. This time, there was no political storm, no royal decrees, no brothers to forbid it. Who cared what an exiled prince did anymore? The world had moved on. But for Nicholas, it was a way to avoid dying alone, a way to find some warmth in the final stretch of his journey. But even as he found personal peace, his eyes remained fixed on the East. He never stopped watching Romania. He never stopped hoping. He followed the rise of Nicolae Ceausescu, the new communist dictator who, for a brief moment in the late 60s, seemed to promise a more independent, nationalist form of communism. But Nicholas was not fooled. He saw the tyranny beneath the surface. He knew that his homeland was suffering. He would often stand on the balcony of his apartment in Madrid, looking east, a prince in exile, dreaming of the Carpathians. knowing in his heart that he would never walk those forest paths again. He was the guardian of a memory, the keeper of a flame that was flickering low but had not yet gone out. He prepared himself for the end, not with fear, but with the quiet resignation of a soldier who has fought his war and is ready to fade away. As the 1970s dawned, bringing with them a modern world of disco, détente, and democratization in Spain following the death of Franco, Prince Nicholas of Romania remained a figure carved from the stone of a different epoch. Living in Madrid with his second wife, Teresa, he had entered the final act of his life, a period of quiet reflection that inevitably invited a rigorous interrogation of his legacy. This decade of his life was not marked by the high drama of abdications or the romance of elopements, but by something perhaps more profound, the long, slow judgment of history. It was in these twilight years that the true weight of the Nicholas question began to settle, a debate that would outlive the man himself. To the few visitors who sought him out in Madrid, historians, journalists, or younger members of the Romanian diaspora, Nicholas appeared as a benign, distinguished elder statesman. But beneath the calm exterior lay the subject of one of the most fierce and unresolved debates in Romanian history. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, was simple yet devastating. Was he a traitor to his duty or a martyr to his integrity? The official narrative crafted by King Carol II in the 1930s, and surprisingly maintained by the communist regime for their own purposes, was that Nicholas was a deserter. The argument was clinical and unforgiving. A prince of the blood is born with a debt to the nation that can never be fully repaid. By prioritizing his personal happiness with Ioana Doletti over the stability of the dynasty, Nicholas had supposedly committed a dereliction of duty comparable to a soldier deserting his post in wartime. Critics pointed to the fragile state of Romania in the 1930s, a country sandwiched between Stalin and Hitler, and argued that the royal family could not afford the luxury of private lives. In this harsh light, Nicholas's refusal to annul his marriage was seen not as romantic heroism, but as selfish obstinacy. He was the playboy prince who threw away his position because he couldn't master his own heart. However, as Nicholas sat in his study in Madrid, surrounded by the memoirs of his contemporaries and the letters of his mother, Queen Marie, a powerful counter-narrative began to emerge, a defense that would eventually form the bedrock of his rehabilitation. The victim theory posits that Nicholas's exile had almost nothing to do with the marriage law and everything to do with raw Machiavellian power. Historians began to peel back the layers of the 1937 crisis, revealing that the marriage issue was merely a convenient pretext. The reality was that Nicholas was simply too dangerous to keep in Bucharest. Consider the facts. In 1937, King Carol II was moving toward a royal dictatorship. He was dissolving political parties, censoring the press, and manipulating the Constitution. In this slide toward authoritarianism, Nicholas represented a glaring problem. He was the good brother. He was the one who had served as regent without scandal. He was the one who had actually fought in the Great War's aftermath. He was the one who drove his own cars and spoke to mechanics and peasants without condescension. In the eyes of the army and the populace, Nicholas was the spare who should have been the heir. If Carol II were to be overthrown, a very real possibility given the turbulent politics of the time, Nicholas was the obvious popular replacement. Therefore, the traitor label was a fabrication, a political hit job designed to neutralize a rival. Nicholas wasn't exiled for loving Ioana. He was exiled for being loved by Romania. This period of reflection also opens the door to the agonizing game of what if, a question that surely haunted Nicholas in the quiet, sleepless nights of his exile. What if he had fought back? In 1930, when Carroll returned, Nicholas held all the cards. He was the regent. He commanded the loyalty of the army. He could have arrested Carroll at the airport. He could have refused to step down. Had Nicholas possessed the ruthlessness of his brother, he could have established himself as the strongman of Romania. Historians argue that a Romania led by Nicholas would have been fundamentally different. Nicholas was less intelligent than Carroll, perhaps, but he was infinitely more stable. He was pro-British and pro-French, deeply influenced by his mother's Western outlook. He loathed the intrigue and corruption that flourished under Carroll. A reign of King Nicholas I, or a prolonged regency under him, might have provided the stability Romania needed to resist the pull of fascism. There might have been no royal dictatorship, no alienation of the political parties, and perhaps a more unified front when the war came. But Nicholas was not a usurper. His fatal flaw, in political terms, was his decency. He loved his brother more than he loved power, and by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. The tragedy of Nicholas is the tragedy of a good man in a bad time, a man who brought a knife to a gunfight, armed only with his honor. In Madrid, Nicholas remained stoic about these debates. He rarely gave interviews to defend himself. He believed with an almost aristocratic detachment that the truth would eventually surface without his shouting it. He focused instead on the small, meaningful acts of keeping the flame alive. He maintained a correspondence with his nephew, the exiled King Michael. Their relationship is a touching coda to the family drama. Michael, who had been a child pawn in the feud between his father and uncle, had grown into a man of immense wisdom. He recognized that Nicholas had been wronged. While Michael could not officially reinstate Nicholas to the line of succession, the monarchy was abolished, and such decrees were moot. He treated Nicholas with the deference due a senior royal. They were two men who had lost the same kingdom, bonded by the unique trauma of the Hohenzollern legacy. But the 1970s also brought physical decline. The athletic body that had once piloted speedboats and raced Alfa Romeos began to fail. Nicholas's heart, which had endured so much metaphorical strain, began to weaken physically. He spent his days in a quieter rhythm, walking in the parks of Madrid when his health allowed, painting and listening to the news from behind the Iron Curtain. The reports from Romania were grim. Ceausescu's regime was tightening its grip, demolishing the historic Bucharest that Nicholas remembered, and rewriting history to erase the monarchy entirely. To the communist youth of the 1970s, Prince Nicholas was not even a name. He was a ghost, purged from the textbooks. There is a profound sadness in this erasure. Imagine being a man who once held the destiny of a nation in his hands, now living anonymously in a foreign capital, watching your homeland being systematically destroyed from afar, knowing that your own name has been forbidden. Yet Nicholas never became bitter. Those who were with him in the final months speak of a man who had made peace with his choices. He had chosen Ioana. He had chosen love. And looking back, even from the vantage point of old age and obscurity, he maintained that it was the right choice. He had lived a human life, rich in emotion and truth rather than a hollow royal existence. The end came in the summer of 1978. On July 9th in Madrid, Prince Nicholas of Romania passed away at the age of 74. It was not a death that stopped the world. There were no breaking news bulletins on global television, no flags flying at half-mast in Bucharest. The communist regime in Romania ignored it completely. To mention the death of a parasitic royal would have been counter-revolutionary. The funeral was a poignant reflection of his life, dignified, royal, but heartbreakingly exiled. He was not laid to rest in the cathedral of Curtea de Argeș, the necropolis of the Romanian kings, where his parents Ferdinand and Marie slept. He could not go home. Instead, he was buried in the cemetery of Prilly near Lausanne, Switzerland, alongside his beloved Ioana. It was a choice that spoke volumes. Even in death, he chose her. He chose to lie beside the woman who had caused his fall but saved his soul, rather than seek a place in a pantheon that had rejected him. The service was attended by King Michael and Queen Anne and a gathering of the European royal diaspora. It was a gathering of ghosts, kings without crowns, princes without lands, bidding farewell to one of their own. As the coffin was lowered into the Swiss earth, far from the dark forests of the Carpathians, it seemed that the story of Prince Nicholas had ended in silence. He was Nicolae Brina to the legal records, a man who had died in obscurity. For decades that silence prevailed. The grave in Prilly became overgrown, visited only by a few loyal monarchists and family members. The name Nicholas faded into the footnotes of history books, overshadowed by the tyranny of Ceausescu and the eventual violent revolution of 1989. When Romania finally liberated itself, the focus was on the return of King Michael, the living symbol of the Constitution. Nicholas, the dead uncle, the failed regent, remained in the shadows. But history is not static. It is a living thing, constantly being excavated and re-examined. As the dust of the revolution settled and Romania began to reclaim its true past, historians began to look again at the interwar period. They looked past the propaganda of Carol II and the lies of the communists. They found the letters, the diaries, and the diplomatic cables. They rediscovered the prince who had been the idol of the youth, the regent who had tried to be a father to a king. A new generation of Romanians, unburdened by the biases of the past, began to see Nicholas not as a traitor, but as a romantic hero, a modern figure who prioritized individual authenticity over archaic tradition. The question of his legitimacy began to be raised in legal and royal circles. If his removal from the succession was an act of political vengeance by an authoritarian king, was it valid? If his marriage was a crime of the heart, did it deserve an eternal sentence of banishment? The Brana name began to be seen for what it was, a slur. The movement to rehabilitate him grew, not just as a matter of royal protocol, but as a matter of national healing. Romania was recovering its soul, and part of that soul was the memory of the prince who had been left behind. And so the stage was set for the final miraculous act of this drama. It would not happen in his lifetime, nor in the lifetime of his brother or his wife. It would take nearly half a century after his death for the wheel of fate to turn completely. But the story of Nicholas was not destined to end in a Swiss graveyard. The exile was long, the night was dark, but the dawn of restitution was approaching. The prince was coming home. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the violent overthrow of the Ceausescu regime in Bucharest that December did not merely liberate a people, it unlocked a frozen history. For 45 years, the truth of Romania's past had been held captive, twisted by ideologues to serve the state. But as the 1990s and 2000s unfolded, the archives were open, and the Romanian people began a painful but necessary process of relearning who they were. In this great national excavation, the royal family returned to the public consciousness, not as the caricatures painted by communist propaganda, but as human beings who had shaped the nation's identity. King Michael I returned to his homeland, greeted by millions, a living bridge to the pre-war era. and in his wake, the ghost of Prince Nicholas began to stir. For decades, Nicholas had been resting in the quiet cemetery of Prilly in Switzerland, a modest grave for a former head of state. But in the new Romania, the injustice of his resting place became increasingly glaring. Why was the man who had guided the country through the Regency, the man who had been the idol of the interwar army lying in foreign soil under a disputed name? The Brena Decree of 1937 was increasingly viewed by legal scholars and historians not as a valid law, but as an act of royal tyranny, a personal vendetta by Carol II that had no place in a modern, understanding society. The Crown of Romania, now under the custodianship of King Michael's daughter Margareta, began to take steps to right the wrongs of the past. They recognized that the family could not be whole until all its members were home. The decision was made. It would take time to navigate the complex protocols of international exhumation and the delicate diplomacy of the church, but the resolve was fixed. Prince Nicholas was coming home. The date was set for October 2024. It had been 46 years since his lonely death in Madrid, and 87 years since he was banished from his homeland on that heartbreaking train ride. The symbolism was profound. The return was not just a movement of bones. It was a reversal of the verdict of 1937. It was history overturning the judgment of a king. On October 15, 2024, a solemn ceremony took place in Lausanne. The remains of Prince Nicholas and his beloved wife, Ioana, were exhumed. Even in this, the narrative held true. They were not separated. The woman who had been denied the title of princess in life was now accorded the honors of royalty in death, traveling side by side with her husband. Their caskets, draped in the Romanian tricolor, the blue, yellow, and red flag that Nicholas had once sworn to defend, were loaded onto a plane bound for Bucharest. When the aircraft touched down at Otopeni Airport, it was not Mr. Brena who arrived. It was His Royal Highness Prince Nicholas of Romania. He was met not by the secret police who had once hounded him, but by a guard of honor from the 30th Michael the Brave Guards Brigade. The military he had loved, the army he had once inspected as a dashing young general, was there to welcome him back. A military band played the royal anthem. It was the salute he had been denied for nearly a century. The cortege moved through the country, heading toward Curtea de Argeș, the spiritual heart of the Romanian monarchy. This ancient town, nestled in the foothills of the Carpathians, is the resting place of the kings, Carol I, Ferdinand, Carol II, and Michael. To be buried here is to be written into the eternal stone of the nation. By bringing Nicholas here, the royal house was making a definitive statement. Nicholas belongs to the dynasty. His exile was an interruption, not an erasure. On October 18, 2024, the final funeral service was held at the new Episcopal and Royal Cathedral. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of history. The custodian of the crown, Margareta, stood with the royal family, witnessing the closure of a circle that had begun before she was born. The Romanian Orthodox Church, which had once been pressured by Carol II to condemn the marriage, now performed the full rites of burial for a princely member of the founder's family. As the coffins of Nicholas and Ioana were carried into the crypt, the silence was heavy with meaning. Nicholas was being laid to rest near his brother, Carol II. In life, they had been torn apart by jealousy and politics. In death, they were reunited in the cool, impartial silence of the cathedral. But there was a sense of moral victory for Nicholas. Carol II had died in exile in Portugal, his reputation forever stained by his dictatorship and his abandonment of the country. Nicholas, however, returned as the good prince. the man whose reputation had only grown brighter with the passage of time. He had lost the political battle in 1937, but he had won the war for posterity. The story of Prince Nicholas of Romania is, in the end, a story about the cost of authenticity. Most royal lives are defined by duty, by the suppression of the self for the sake of the institution. Nicholas broke that mold. He was a man who refused to live a lie. He possessed a clarity of character that was rare in his time and dangerous in his position. He recognized that a title is merely a social construct, but love, genuine, sacrificial, enduring love, is a fundamental truth. He paid a terrible price for that truth. He lost his princely status, his fortune, his friends, and his homeland. He spent half his life as a stranger in strange lands, watching the world move on without him. But as the stone door of the crypt in Curtea de Argeș closed, securing his place in eternity, the ledger of his life finally balanced. He had kept his promises. He had kept his honor. He had kept the woman he loved. And in the end, he kept his country too. History is often written by the victors, but as the saga of Prince Nicholas proves, time has a way of editing the manuscript. The authoritarian king who banished him is now remembered as a cautionary tale of hubris, while the exiled brother is celebrated as a symbol of dignity. Prince Nicholas of Romania, the regent, the exile, the lover, the mechanic, the patriot, reminds us that while crowns may rust and thrones may crumble, the integrity of the human heart is indestructible. He was the prince who lost a kingdom to gain a life, and in doing so, he became something far greater than a king. He became a man who was truly free.